Welcome, everybody, back to the Hannah Sports Podcast. I'm Andrew Hannah. Today, we are going to be talking news from around the NFL, and this is also going to be our free agency edition. We're going to be taking a look at who your team signed, and do I feel that they overpaid? Let's kick it off. And this is a story from April 3rd coming out of ESPN. Agent says Jalen Carter to visit only teams with the top 10 pick. It says that Georgia defensive tackle Jalen Carter is declining visits with any team selecting outside the top 10 in this month's NFL draft, agent Drew Rosenhaus told ESPN's Adam Schefter. Carter is scheduled to visit the Chicago Bears, who will pick 9th on Monday. It will be his second visit after previously visiting the Philadelphia Eagles, who have the number 10 pick. Quote, I'm confident Jalen will go in the top 10. He's a good person, a family man, loves football, and is a generational talent. Carter was invited to the NFL draft, which will be held in Kansas City, Missouri this year, and plans to attend. Carter's draft status is clouded after he pleaded no contest to misdemeanor charges of reckless driving and racing last month in connection with a fatal crash in January. He was sentenced to 12 months of probation, a $1,000 fine, and 80 hours of community service, and will attend a state-approved defensive driving course. His attorney, Kim Stevens, said that by resolving the matter, the state of Georgia is forever barred from bringing additional charges against Carter. In a statement to ESPN, Stevens said Carter did not cause a car wreck on January 15th, in which Georgia football player Devin Wilcock and recruiting staffer Chandler LeCroy were killed. Meanwhile, Carter weighed 323 pounds at Georgia's Pro Day last month, 9 pounds heavier than he was at the scouting combine in Indianapolis. He opted to do only position drills, which he didn't finish, and didn't participate in other aspects of the workout, including the 40-yard dash, cone drills, and other physical tests. ESPN's Mel Kiper has Carter being selected by the Detroit Lions at number 6 in his most recent mock draft. The 6'3" player was a unanimous All-American in 2022. He earned All-SEC first-team honors and was named a finalist for the Rotary Lombardi Award as the nation's top lineman. When it comes to Jalen Carter, what happened in January, it's going to take a toll. Everybody wants to talk about his poor performance at his pro day, and honestly, if something like that happens and you got and Carter only just turned 22 2 days ago. When you're that young and you got this sort of stress going on around you and all this bad media, I imagine that's all going to take a toll. The fact that he showed up heavier and put forth the poor performance, it's all in his head. But the main issue with that I see is that he's got to be able to overcome adversity, because that's what it's going to be in the NFL. And I think that this right here could hurt him a little bit, not necessarily for his performance, but how he's handling the messy situation that was the car wreck in January. Will he go in the top 10? I don't really have an answer to that. Hearing, Jalen Carter, without a doubt, before the whole January incident or whatever, was going to be a top 10 pick. The best thing to do, I think, for the organization that picks him is to sit him down, get him calm, get him in the right frame of mind to continue on with his career and try to put all of this past him, because he was a hell of a talent, and he is a hell of a talent. I shouldn't even say is a hell of a talent. And he's definitely worthy of a top 10 pick, but I think it's a little bit cocky to say that he's only meeting with teams in the top 10, because at this point, it's like, you need to be humble in this situation. You were a clear top 10 pick, but that was kind of a really messy situation that happened back in January. And so I think he needs to sort of humble himself and realize that he might not be a top 10 pick anymore for those reasons of the baggage that might come with him, and potentially some NFL scouts and front offices might think that there might be a little bit of a situation when it comes to his character, when it comes to handling adversity. If with the whole pro day fiasco and putting on, 9 pounds, I think it just comes with the situation that he's in. And this story coming out yesterday from the ESPN news services. John Elway is no longer with Broncos as the contract ends. Denver Broncos legend John Elway is no longer employed by the franchise as his consulting contract ended and will not be renewed. Elway confirmed his departure to Channel 9 News in Denver on Tuesday, saying that the new ownership of the team puts the Broncos in good hands. His contract as a consultant expired on the first day of the 2023 NFL League year on March 15th. Elway, 62, said that his decision was made after a meeting with new co-owner Greg Penner, who has called Elway the ultimate Bronco. From 2011 to 2021, Elway ran the Broncos front office as general manager and executive vice president of football operations. The Broncos hired George Patton as general manager in 2021, and Elway transitioned to a consultant role. Quote, I've enjoyed the relationship with the Broncos for a long time. I told Greg I'd be happy to be a resource for him and help in any way that I can. I just wanted the flexibility. They're in great hands. I still plan on being around to watch and be a resource for Greg or George if I can. And a congratulations to John Elway as he takes a kind of a step back from the front office roles to kind of enjoy the rest of his life a little bit, be there need be as he can. He is the ultimate Bronco. I don't know how you can think of the Denver Broncos without John Elway. If there's a more famous Bronco, I don't know him. Congratulations to John Elway on an amazing career. And coming out this morning from Brady Henderson of ESPN, Bobby Wagner returning to Seattle Seahawks with no grudges. Bobby Wagner will be back in the middle of the Seattle Seahawks defense and back in his familiar number 54 after wearing number 45 last year in his lone season with the LA Rams. But in his first public comment since returning to the organization, with which he built a Hall of Fame resume, the 8-time Pro Bowl linebacker said he's somewhat treating it as though he's joining a new team, and he isn't holding on to any of the hard feelings he had when he left. Quote, it's been great just being back in the building, Wagner said Wednesday during a virtual news conference from the Seahawks Renton, Washington headquarters. Things didn't end that great, and I don't live that far from the building, so I would drive by and not have too many nice things to say about the building until this happened, so it's good to be back in this place. Wagner's first stint with Seattle came to an unceremonious end last March when he caught wind of the Seahawks' plans to move on from him before he heard it directly from the team. Wagner, who continues to serve as his own agent, negotiated his one-year, $5.5 million deal, which includes $4.48 million guaranteed and $1.02 million tied to per-game roster bonuses and an additional $1.5 million available in incentives. He said he wants to retire as a Seahawk and that he plans on playing beyond 2022. And you know what? He had a hell of a season last year with the Rams. Age isn't really slowing him down, so I think Seattle will be happy to have him back, and I think that they could probably get a few more years out of him. And clearly he's happy there because he's taken a contract for cheap. A name like Bobby Wagner, he should be getting a lot more money than what he got. But it's just for a season, and it's a team-friendly deal. And it sounds like there were some hurt feelings when they left. So coming back to a mutual agreement like this that is team-friendly and coming in with this attitude, Bobby Wagner did exactly what he should do. And after this season, he might get, a better payday, which I imagine that he will. Now we're going to get on to the free agency side of things. On Fox Sports, they have the free agency tracker of all the teams, and we haven't talked about free agency yet because free agency ended before I started the podcast. So we're just going to talk about a couple signings for your team because here they have listed their stats from the previous year. And I'm going to take a look at it and see if you guys overpaid or underpaid. And I'm going to leave out players that re-signed with their team. This is about who is coming in new for your team. And did you guys get a team-friendly deal? So let's begin with the Arizona Cardinals. So the Cardinals, looking to add some depth at receiver, are bringing in Zach Pascal from the Philadelphia Eagles on a 2-year, $4.5 million deal. Last season in 22, it said that he was targeted 18 times and he had 15 receptions for 150 yards and a touchdown. For the money, I'd say they got a damn good deal. 15 catches on 18 targets is nothing to scoff at, even if you didn't see the field. Moving on to the Atlanta Falcons, as we got a bunch of new players coming in for Atlanta. Got safety Jesse Bates III from the Cincinnati Bengals on 4 years for $64 million. So that would be an average annual salary of $16 million per season. In 2022, he had 71 combined tackles, 4 interceptions, a forced fumble, and 8 passes defended. I think that this is a decent price to pay. Decent in coverage, and he was good against the run. And with what you're paying him, 4 picks last year, which was tied for 7th in the league. Not the best, not the worst. You could really do a lot worse. The Falcons also getting defensive lineman David Onyemata for 3 years, $35 million, $24.5 million guaranteed. And his average annual salary will be $11.6 million. Last year having 35 tackles, 5 sacks, and a fumble recover. Honestly, I think they paid too much. And it was probably just because of the market, but honestly, for the production that he put out last year, I would have gone with $7-8 million a season. Tried to save a couple million anyways. He's going to be 31 this year. $11.6 million average salary for the 5 sacks. It's okay. Tied for 22nd. It's not terrible. The Falcons are also bringing in Taylor Heinicke for 2 years, up to $20 million from the Commanders, who last year in 9 starts had 12 touchdowns and 6 interceptions. This, I think, was a very good signing. I've always liked Taylor Heinicke. I thought that he was pretty solid for a backup. I thought he would be getting the start this year when I saw that he was signing. But the Falcons have already announced that they're going to go with Desmond Ridder to start the season, so we'll see how that goes. I imagine they're not going to wait forever to put Heinicke in if they see that the Desmond Ridder situation is not working out. Also, coming to the Falcons from the Baltimore Ravens, defensive lineman Calais Campbell, who last season had 28 total tackles, 6 sacks, and 2 forced fumbles. They signed him for 1 year, $7 million. Decent at plugging up the run. Just a massive mountain of a man. 6'8", 307 pounds. That's a big man filling the line there. And for his production last year, pretty solid. $7 million, it's fair. Now going over to the Buffalo Bills, getting Damian Harris for 1 year, $1.7 million. That's definitely a team-friendly contract. Did decent enough running last year, averaging 4.5 yards a carry, 463 yards and 3 touchdowns. So I think that'll be good. Also coming into Buffalo from the Dallas Cowboys, guard Connor McGovern for 3 years, $23 million, which would be an average annual salary of $7.4 million a season. Last year was 40th in the league with 909 total snaps. He only drew 1 penalty, and he only gave up 2 sacks. Solid numbers there. Based on those numbers, I think he will be a good fit in there with Buffalo. Also coming into Buffalo from the Miami Dolphins, Trent Sherfield at receiver, who is coming to the team for 1 year for $1.7 million. Last season, he had 30 receptions on 48 targets for 417 yards and 2 touchdowns. Only 27 years old. Decent size, decent signing. Moving on to the Carolina Panthers. Defensive lineman Shai Tuttle for 3 years, $19.5 million, which will average out to $6.5 million per average annual salary. And last season, he had 48 tackles and 3 sacks. For only $6.5 million a season, he's good at plugging up on the runs. He'll get you a few sacks. I think that is a solid signing for the price. The Panthers are also getting tight end Hayden Hurst from the Cincinnati Bengals on a 3-year, $21.7 million deal with an average annual salary of $7.2 million a season. Last year, Hayden had 52 receptions on 65 targets, both of those top 15, for 414 yards and 2 touchdowns. You know, as far as tight ends, there's only a few of them in the NFL that have a big name. So to get one for, average $7.2 million, going to get you, a couple yards per game, maybe a touchdown here and there. I wouldn't call it a terrible signing. I wouldn't call it a great signing. Let's see how he does there with whoever Carolina is going to be drafting for quarterback. Because I think that's going to be the most exciting thing, and the buzz that's building around Carolina right now is who they're going to take with that number 1 pick in the draft. Also coming on to the Panthers from the Cincinnati Bengals, got safety Von Bell who signed a 3-year, $22.5 million, $13 million guaranteed, and an average annual salary of $7.5 million a season. Von Bell, last season, 77 combined tackles, with 4 interceptions, a fumble recover, was targeted 42 times, and allowed 29 receptions. Overall, not a terrible deal, but having 4 picks last year, that was tied for 7th in the league, so not a bad deal. Last year, he had 4 interceptions, which was tied for 7th in the league. So top 10 in an interception cornerback, $7.5 million. I'll take it. Panthers are also bringing in, from the Saints, quarterback Andy Dalton, who last year had 2,871 pass yards for 18 touchdowns and only 9 interceptions, 95.2 passer rating. Only 2 years, $10 million, $8 million guaranteed. This is a signing that I really liked, because if you don't want to throw the new quarterback to the wolves straight out the gate, you could start the season off with Andy Dalton. Let your new quarterback get comfortable, being behind a veteran who's been around the league for over 10 years. This is a very cheap, team-friendly deal for what I thought he did production-wise last year. 18 touchdowns, 9 picks, not a great ratio, 2-to-1. But a 95.2 passer rating and almost 3,000 pass yards. He did a solid job. Mr. Ginger himself. Panthers are also getting from the Eagles running back Miles Sanders on a 4-year, $26 million deal, which will be an average annual salary of $6.3 million. Last year, Miles Sanders had 259 carries for 1,271 rush yards, 11 touchdowns, and averaged 4.9 yards per carry. Overall, I'd say that's a pretty solid deal for what you're getting. I've always liked Miles Sanders. Been my fantasy running back a few times, and those numbers could be elevated because he was playing for a fantastic Philadelphia Eagles team last year. But I've never minded Miles Sanders' ability. I think he's a damn good running back. Great vision. I'm excited for this signing for the Panthers, and $6.3 million, and I'm sure Miles Sanders is excited too, because he's going to be working with, the number 1 pick in the draft. I imagine that's going to bring a little bit of buzz and excitement. And last but not least, coming to the Panthers, my boy from the Vikings, Mr. Adam Thielen. I was sad to see him go, but I understood why we did it. Thielen signed for 3 years for $25 million, $14 million guaranteed, and an average annual salary of $8.3 million. Thielen last year had caught 70 passes, which was 29th in the league, on 103 targets, and had 716 receiving yards and 6 touchdowns. That 6 touchdowns was also tied for top 20. He was tied for 19th. And Thielen, I've always liked Thielen. Great on routes. He may not be the fastest guy on the field, but he's got them sure hands, and he can get open. Sad to see him go. Understand why we did it. $8.3 million a season. It's deserving. Moving on to the Chicago Bears. They have signed from the Philadelphia Eagles, T.J. Edwards, for 3 years, $19.5 million, $12 million guaranteed, for an average annual salary of $6.5 million per season. T.J. Edwards last year had 159 combined tackles, 2 sacks, and a fumble recovered, for only an average annual salary of $6.5 million a year. Fucking A, why are the Bears they're being smart. They're being smart. That's a very, I think, team-friendly deal for a linebacker that's going to be all over the field. Honestly, I'm not really looking forward to this season as a Vikings fan, if I'm being honest. There's nothing really to get excited about. From the Tennessee Titans, guard Nate Davis on 3 years, $30 million deal, $19 million guaranteed. Nate Davis last year, having a solid year, played in 682 total snaps. He had 4 penalties and only gave up 3 sacks. Another solid signing. And maybe give Justin Fields a little bit more protection. The Bears are also getting Tremaine Edmonds for 4 years, $72 million, $50 million guaranteed, with an average annual salary of $18 million per season. He was the 16th overall pick in the 2018 draft, and he's in his 5 years with the Bills. He's been all over the field. Over 100 tackles per season he's bringing in. I think it's kind of high. So for the production that you're getting, somebody that you're going to be able to team up with, TJ Edwards, they're going after the right people. There's some buzz going around Chicago right now amongst Bears fans, I know. And, we'll see how that plays out. Coming to the Bears from the Green Bay Packers, Robert Tonyan at tight end on a 1-year, $2.6 million contract. Very team-friendly. Tonyan last year had he was 13th in receptions with 53 receptions on 63 targets for 470 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns. Another option for Justin Fields to throw to. I'd say it's a solid signing. And moving on to the Cincinnati Bengals. They're going to be bringing in from the Kansas City Chiefs at 4 years, $64 million with an average annual salary of $16 million, Orlando Brown Jr. at offensive tackle. Orlando, the last 4 years, he's been a Pro Bowler. I like the signing. I like the price at $16 million a season. Did take a step back last year. I think last year he played in over 1,100 snaps, 1,133 snaps he played in, and had 6 penalties, which was tied for 36th among tackles, and he had 4 sacks allowed. 6'8", 345 pounds. That's a big boy, all right? I think he's going to do nicely there blocking for Mr. Burrow. The Bengals are also getting safety Nick Scott from the LA Rams on a 3-year, $12 million deal with an average salary of $4 million a season. Last year, he had 86 combined tackles, 2 forced fumbles, 2 interceptions, and 5 passes defended. But as far as the coverage side of things went, he was targeted 38 times and gave up 30 receptions. Not a very great ratio. But very team-friendly deal, only $4 million a season. And moving on to the Cleveland Browns, they are getting defensive end Obo Okoronkwo from the Houston Texans for 3 years, $22 million, 12.5 guaranteed, with an average annual salary of $6.3 million. Last year, he had 44 total tackles, 5 sacks, and a forced fumble. Solid signing there for the Browns. Browns are also getting safety Juan Thornhill from the Kansas City Chiefs for 3 years, $21 million, with $10 million guaranteed, and an average annual salary of $7 million per season. Last season, had 71 combined tackles, 3 interceptions, 9 passes defended, and allowed 24 receptions on 38 targets. For $7 million a season, and a man with experience of winning 2 Super Bowl championships. This is a good sign. Also bringing in from the Minnesota Vikings, they're bringing in Dalvin Tomlinson on a 4-year, $57 million, $27.5 million guaranteed, with an average annual salary of $14.2 million. Last season, Dalvin had 37 total tackles, 3 sacks, and a forced fumble. He's proved to be a decent pass rusher. He's a great lineman. But I don't think he's put forth the production to earn $14.2 million a season. I know it wasn't just him, but the Vikings' defense last year was one of the worst in every defensive category, including stopping the run. He's decent in the pass rush. His run defense, questionable. For $14.3 million a season, I think that the Cleveland Browns paid too much. But that seems to be a thing over there because, Watson and stuff. Going to the Dallas Cowboys. They are only bringing in one this year. Is running back Ronald Jones from the Kansas City Chiefs on a 1-year, $1.2 million contract. Very cheap. Last year, didn't see the field much in Kansas City, but he averaged over 4 yards per carry. It's 17 carries, 70 yards, and a touchdown. For as cheap as you're getting him, might be a nice rotation guy in there with the Zeke leaving. For the Denver Broncos, they're bringing in from the 49ers, offensive tackle Mike McGlinchey for 5 years, $87.5 million, $50 million guaranteed for an average annual salary of $17.5 million. Mike, throughout his career, has started all 69 games that he has played in. Last season, he was top 20 in the league, playing 1,036 snaps. He had 10 penalties, which was tied for 8th most, and gave up 6 sacks, which was tied for 15th most. Paying $17.5 million for okay is too much. I think they overpaid here. He's still only 28 years old, though, so he could have a bounce-back season, but at the initial signing of this from the outside looking in, I think Denver paid too much. But who I don't think they're overpaying for is Mr. Ben Powers, who is guard coming to them from the Baltimore Ravens for 4 years, $52 million, $28.5 million guaranteed, for an average annual salary of $12.8 million. Now, Mr. Ben Powers last year was tied for 15th amongst guards with 1,094 snaps played, only had 1 penalty, and gave up 0 sacks. For one of the best pass blocking guards in the league, one of the better passing blocking guards in the league, $12.8 million is a fair price to pay. The Broncos are also getting quarterback Jarrett Stidham from the Vegas Raiders for 2 years, $10 million, $5 million guaranteed. Last season had 656 pass yards, 4 touchdowns, 3 interceptions, and an 89.2 quarterback rating. Now, Mr. Let's Ride himself, if he doesn't have a solid beginning to this season, I imagine that he's going to get benched. And Mr. Jarrett Stidham might see some significant playing time in Denver this year. And for only $5 million guaranteed, I think that's a pretty solid deal for the Broncos, personally. Also coming to the Broncos from the Arizona Cardinals, getting defensive lineman Zach Allen on 3 years, $45.75 million, with $32.5 million guaranteed and an average annual salary of $15.2 million. Zach Allen last season had 37 total tackles and was tied for 17th with 6 sacks. You know, for almost a top 15 end, I mean, with the cap hit that he's going to be costing the team, I think that they might have overpaid a little on Zach Allen. He's going to have to boost them numbers up just a little bit more if he's going to be worthy of costing the team $15.2 million. And last, the Broncos are getting from the Cincinnati Bengals Samaje Perine on a 2-year, $7.5 million contract, average annual salary of $3.7 million. Last season, he had 95 carries for 394 yards and 2 touchdowns, averaging 4.1 yards per carry. Also had 38 receptions for 287 yards and 4 touchdowns. For the production that he put out last year, only costing $3.7 million, I really like this signing. Moving on to the Detroit Lions. From the Pittsburgh Steelers, they're getting quarterback Cameron Sutton for 3 years, $33 million, $22.5 million guaranteed, with an average annual salary of $11 million per season. With 43 total tackles, 3 interceptions, and he gave up 36 receptions on 71 targets. For $11.5 million, those are pretty solid numbers. That's the big one right there. On 71 targets, 36 receptions allowed. They are also bringing in from the Chicago Bears running back David Montgomery for 3 years, $18 million, with an average annual salary of $6 million per season. Last year, Montgomery had 201 carries for 801 yards, 5 touchdowns, and averaged 4 yards per carry. He's always been a decent rusher. He is actually, he was my fantasy running back for a little bit last year, but with the struggle that he was having when it came to injuries and staying on the field, and he was rotated out, I eventually dropped him. But the year before, he gave me some good numbers. A solid pickup for the Lions, and a solid pickup for the Lions after losing Jamal Williams this offseason. And last, the Lions are bringing in safety Chauncey Gardner-Johnson from the Philadelphia Eagles on a 1-year, $8 million contract. the co-leader for interceptions last year, as he had 67 total tackles and tied for first, 6 interceptions, allowed 33 receptions on 42 targets. Pretty solid pickup for only $8 million. The co-leader for interceptions. I would say good signing. Going to the Houston Texans, bringing in Jimmy Ward, safety from the 49ers, on 2 years, $13 million, with an average annual salary of $6.5 million per season. Last year, Jimmy proved to be very good, one of the best run defense safeties, according to Pro Football Focus. Last season, having 50 total tackles, 3 interceptions, which was tied for 20th among safeties, and had 57 receptions allowed on 70 targets. Only $6.5 million in the season. I like this signing for Houston. They are also bringing in Case Keenum from the Buffalo Bills at 2 years, $6.2 million, $4 million guaranteed, and he appeared in 2 games last year as a backup. It's not breaking the team, so we'll call it solid signing. Getting Dalton Schultz at tight end from the Dallas Cowboys on a 1-year, $9 million contract. And last season, he had 57 receptions on 86 targets for 577 receiving yards and 5 touchdowns, which was tied for 7th most in the league. Tied for 7th most touchdowns among tight ends, top 10 in receiving yards, almost broke the top 10. He was 11th in receptions among tight ends for $9 million a season. It's solid. I like the signing. I think he'll do good in Houston. Also bringing in from the Buffalo Bills, Devin Singletary at running back on a 1-year, $3.75 million contract. Last season, Devin had 177 carries for 819 yards, 5 touchdowns, and averaged 4.6 yards per carry. For only $3.75 million, you could do so much worse than Devin Singletary. I think that he will have an impact in Houston personally with the lack of weapons that they currently have. Also getting from the Raiders, former Pro Bowler from 2021, linebacker Denzel Perryman on a 1-year deal worth $3.5 million. Last season, he had 83 total tackles, 2 interceptions. Those 2 interceptions were tied for 4th amongst linebackers. Run defense was solid. Coverage was all right. For $3.5 million, former Pro Bowler. Moving on to the Indianapolis Colts, getting defensive lineman from the 49ers, Samson Ebukam, for 3 years, $27 million, with an average annual salary of $8 million per year. Last year had 36 combined tackles with 5 sacks and a forced fumble. For $8 million a year, I think it's a pretty solid signing. They're also getting from the Eagles, the man, the myth, the legend himself, Gardner Minshew. 1 year, $3.5 million. Last year, 663 pass yards, 3 touchdowns, 3 interceptions. Might have a chance with the Colts. You never know. Gardner Minshew might be your next quarterback in Indianapolis. And last, for the Colts, bringing in from the Buffalo Bills, wide receiver Isaiah McKenzie for 1 year, $1.2 million. Last year, he had 42 receptions on 62 targets for 423 yards and 4 touchdowns, adding some depth to the Indianapolis Colts. The Jacksonville Jaguars had none. No new free agents coming in from. The Kansas City Chiefs are bringing in from the Jaguars for 4 years, $80 million, $60 million guaranteed, with an average annual salary of $20 million a season, Jawan Taylor, who has proven to be a solid pass blocker. Struggles a little bit with the run, but last year was 11th in snaps among tackles with 1,095, had 7 penalties, which was tied for 27th, and 5 sacks allowed, which was tied for 25th. Honestly, I think that they paid too much because of what Orlando Brown Jr. got leaving the team. You're not really getting, I think, much of a change. And with how much you're paying him, because what was that? Average annual salary of $20 million, and I believe Orlando Brown has an average annual salary of $14 million a season. I mean, I would have tried to get Orlando back. Also bringing in from the San Francisco 49ers defensive tackle Charles Omenihu for 2 years, $20 million with an average annual salary of $8 million. Last season having 13 tackles, 5 sacks, and a forced fumble. He also got to the quarterback and hit the quarterback 16 times. I call this a win for the Kansas City Chiefs. They are also bringing in from the Tampa Bay Buccaneers safety Mike Edwards on a 1-year, $3 million contract. Last season, having 82 tackles, 2 interceptions, and allowing 29 receptions on 37 targets. For only $3 million a season, I'd call it a solid signing. The Raiders getting from the 49ers Jimmy Garoppolo, 3 years, $67.5 million, $34 million guaranteed, for an average annual salary of $24.2 million. I mean, last season, only 16 touchdowns to 4 interceptions. And that's a very team-friendly contract at $24 million a season. I call this a win. I think he's going to fit in very well in Vegas. Vegas just seems like the place for him. I haven't heard anybody say so far, Jimmy G going to the Raiders doesn't make sense. I've not heard a soul say that yet. They are also getting from the Philadelphia Eagles Marcus Epps at safety for 2 years, $12 million, $8 million guaranteed, with an average annual salary of $6 million per season. Marcus Epps last season, 94 total tackles and allowed 37 receptions on 47 targets. He is amazing on the run defense, but I think for only $6 million a season, you could do worse. I'm going to call that a win for Vegas. Vegas is also bringing in Jacoby Myers from the New England Patriots on a 3-year, $33 million deal with $20 million guaranteed and an average annual salary of $11 million per season. Jacoby Myers last season had 67 receptions on 93 targets for 803 yards and 6 touchdowns. Solid piece for $11 million a season. Somebody for Jimmy G to throw to. I think this is a good signing. The price doesn't bother me at all. Also coming in from the Houston Texans, O.J. Howard at tight end on a 1-year, $1.2 million contract. O.J. Howard last season had 10 receptions on 23 targets for 145 yards, 2 touchdowns. I think it's a solid piece for as cheap as you're getting him. And losing Darren Waller, I think that he'll have a much heavier workload than he did playing in Houston. But just in case, last but not least, they also brought in from the Tennessee Titans Austin Hooper on a 1-year, $2.75 million contract. So a couple of options for Jimmy G to potentially work with. Austin Hooper last year had 41 receptions on 56 targets for 444 yards and 2 touchdowns. Honestly, O.J. Howard, Austin Hooper, I think, are going to have much better production being in Vegas. Jimmy G coming in has a couple of options at tight end now. Both good signings. Moving on to the Los Angeles Chargers. Bringing in my boy, linebacker Eric Kendricks, former first-team All-Pro from the Minnesota Vikings, on a 2-year, $13.2 million contract with $6.7 million guaranteed and an average annual salary of $6.6 million per season. Last season, Kendricks had 137 total tackles and a sack. Still proved to be great in the rush defense, kind of took a step back in coverage. Ultimately, the Vikings couldn't afford him. We let him walk. I like the signing by the Chargers. Very team-friendly deal. And that was it for the Chargers. The LA Rams didn't bring in nobody. So going on from them, we're going to the Miami Dolphins now, who bring in Mr. Mike White himself from the New York Jets for a 2-year contract worth up to $16 million. Last season having a little over 1,100 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, and 4 interceptions for a 75.7 passer rating. $8 million worth up to $8 million per season for a backup over the last 2 years. And Mike White showed signs that he could play last year. So I don't mind this being an option in case Tua gets banged up again. And bringing in from the Tennessee Titans on a 2-year, $11 million contract with an average annual salary of $5.5 million, they're getting linebacker David Long Jr. from the Tennessee Titans, who last season had 86 total tackles, 7 tackles for loss, and 2 interceptions. Proved great in the run defense and was a solid pass rusher. And for only $5.5 million a season, this is a good deal for Miami. And last for the Dolphins, coming in also from the New York Jets, they're getting receiver Braxton Berrios, who last season had 18 receptions on 31 targets for 145 yards, only costing $3.5 million against the cap this year. I think he'll be a lot more productive rotating in Miami than he had with the Jets, because the Jets was just a giant quarterback mess, is what that was. Moving on to my boys, the Minnesota Vikings. The Vikings are bringing in edge rusher, former first-round pick from the New Orleans Saints, Marcus Davenport, who last year had 29 total tackles and a sack, bringing him in on a 1-year, $13 million contract. And you know what? $13 million, I don't think it's a bad price to pay if we were paying for 2021 Marcus Davenport. But we're hoping he goes back to 2021 Marcus Davenport, where he had 9 sacks that season. So hopefully rotating in with Zadarius Smith and Danielle Hunter will work out for him. I like the signing. I don't like the price that we paid for him. But it's just for a 1-year deal. It's not a long-term contract, so let's see what he can do with the season. And Lord knows we need more help on the defense. Also bringing in cornerback Byron Murphy Jr. from the Arizona Cardinals for 2 years, $22 million, with an average annual salary of $8.7 million per season. Last year, he had 36 total tackles and allowed 36 receptions on 56 targets, which ain't the worst. It's pretty solid on the run defense as well. Decent at coverage. I think he's going to step in right away and have a starting role in Minnesota, because if there's anything that we are heavily failing in, it's our cornerbacks. Although we have a couple. Andrew Booth Jr., he got injured last year. We only got to see a little bit of him. I'm praying that our defense can get back to normal, because going this long with a shit defense starting to make me a little itchy. Last but not least, we are getting from the Green Bay Packers, Dean Lowry, 2 years, $8.5 million, with an average annual salary of $4.2 million. Last season, Dean had 43 total tackles and a sack. Rotate him in on the defensive line, call it a day, all right? Get better at stopping the run, for the love of Christ. Moving on to the New England Patriots. They are bringing in offensive tackle Riley Reiff from the Chicago Bears on a 1-year, $5 million contract. Last year, Riley had played 542 offensive snaps and had 4 penalties and 3 sacks allowed. Decent pass blocker, okay on the run. Being that it's only a 1-year, $5 million contract, it's a good signing, I think, for New England. New England is also bringing in former Pro Bowler receiver Juju Smith-Schuster from the Kansas City Chiefs for 3 years, $33 million, with an average annual salary of $8.5 million per season. Last season, had 78 receptions on 97 targets for 933 receiving yards and 3 touchdowns. Juju, I've never been sold on him. I still think he's a solid receiver. And for only $8.5 million a season, Mac Jones, Belichick, they're going to need him. And they are also bringing in from the New York Jets, J-Rob, Mr. James Robinson, for 2 years, $8 million per season, with an average annual salary of $2 million per season. Now, Mr. J-Rob last year had 110 carries for 425 yards, 3 touchdowns, 3.9 yards per carry. Now, if he can get back to 2021, James Robinson, this is a steal for New England. And I think Belichick's going to be able to bring that out of him. I think that is a fantastic signing. And last but not least for New England, they are bringing in tight end Mike Gesicki from the Miami Dolphins on a 1-year, $9 million contract with $3.55 million guaranteed. Last year, Gesicki had 32 receptions on 50 targets for 362 yards and 5 touchdowns. Solid signing. It's not going to cost them much, and another option for Mac Jones to throw to. Going to the New Orleans Saints, Derek Carr, 4 years, $150 million contract, $60 million guaranteed, with an average annual salary of $37.5 million. Now, Derek Carr just turned 32 years old. He was top 15 in attempts, passing yards, touchdowns. Almost broke the top 10 in touchdowns. Tied for the third most interceptions. That's about it. I think it's a good signing because Derek Carr, I still think, has a lot left in the tank. I don't like the way things ended up in Vegas. I don't think anybody really did for that matter. But I think that going to the Saints, he's going to have success. I like the signing. And for average of less than $40 million a season, you have to take that. Also bring in at defensive tackle from the Kansas City Chiefs, Kalen Saunders, for 3 years, $14.5 million with an average annual salary of $4.1 million. Kalen last season had 48 combined tackles and 4 sacks. Also had a couple hurries, a couple hits, solid all around for only $4 million a season. This right here, I would call a win for the Saints. And the ultimate win, last but not least, Jamal Williams. 3 years, $12 million with $8 million guaranteed. Average annual salary of only $4 million a season. And it still blows my mind how they got Jamal for so cheap. He really rose in popularity last year because of his love for anime, which I thought was pretty funny. One of the most likable running backs in the NFL, and also had the most touchdowns on the ground last year for a Lions offense with 17 touchdowns, 4.1 yards per carry, and 1,066 rush yards on 262 carries. Is worth the price, and a huge win for the New Orleans Saints. And moving on to the New York Giants, they're getting linebacker Bobby Okereke from the Indianapolis Colts for 4 years, $40 million, $22 million guaranteed with an average annual salary of $10 million per season. Last season, Okereke finished top 10 with solo tackles with 112, tied for 12th with 36 assists, and tied for third with 2 forced fumbles. His run defense, solid. Coverage, solid. For $10 million a season, I think that they paid him right where they should. And the last one for the Giants, bringing in Paris Campbell, also from the Indianapolis Colts, on a 1-year, $3 million deal. Last season, Campbell had 63 receptions on 85 targets for 623 yards and 3 touchdowns. Solid production, only $3 million a year. I like the signing. A win. I call that a win for the Giants. And coming to the New York Jets from the Green Bay Packers, receiver Allen Lazard. On 4 years, $44 million with $22 million guaranteed and an average annual salary of $11 million. Lazard last season had 60 receptions on 98 targets for 788 receiving yards and 6 touchdowns through the air. That is another weapon out of Green Bay for us. I'm happy with that. Take Rodgers as well. Get him out of here. And last for the Jets, coming from the Kansas City Chiefs, receiver Mecole Hardman for 1 year, up to $6.5 million. Last season had 25 receptions on 33 targets for 297 yards and 4 touchdowns out of those 25 receptions. Up to $6.5 million. I think that's pretty solid. I would call that one a win for the Jets. Moving on to the Philadelphia Eagles. Coming from the Seattle Seahawks, running back Rashad Penny on a 1-year, $1.35 million contract. Last season had 57 carries for 346 yards and 2 touchdowns. Solid runner, 1 year, $1.35 million. I think he'll do well there in Philly. That offense is built for success, and I feel like almost any running back could succeed there right now. And last for the Philadelphia Eagles, bringing in quarterback Marcus Mariota from the Falcons on a 1-year, $5 million contract. Last season had over 2,200 pass yards for 15 touchdowns and 9 interceptions with an 88.2 quarterback rating. Also had 438 yards on the ground for 4 rushing touchdowns. 19 touchdowns to 9 interceptions for only $5 million a year? I mean, you probably aren't going to use him, but it's nice that he's there. And moving on to the Pittsburgh Steelers. 8-time Pro Bowler Patrick Peterson at cornerback from the Minnesota Vikings. At 2 years, $14 million, $5.85 million guaranteed with an average annual salary of $7 million per season. Patrick, last year, had 66 total tackles, was tied for second with 5 interceptions, and allowed 43 receptions on 73 targets. His coverage, still looking phenomenal. Run defense is there. Son of a bitch. Why didn't we bring him back? Plenty of time between now and the season to wallow in self-pity. Moving on. Moving on to the last newcomer for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Coming from the Washington Commanders, linebacker Cole Holcomb on a 3-year, $18 million contract with an average annual salary of $6 million per season. Cole, last season, had 69 total tackles in 7 games. It's almost 10 tackles a game. It's pretty solid. For $6 million a season, I would call that a win. Moving on to the San Francisco 49ers. They sign former Pro Bowl defensive tackle Javon Hargrave from the Philadelphia Eagles for 4 years, $80 million, $40 million guaranteed with an average annual salary of $21 million. Last season, Hargrave had 60 total tackles, 11 sacks, which was 6th most, and a forced fumble. His pass rush, one of the best in the league. For an average of $21 million per season, might be a solid payoff there, especially with how good the defense has been in San Francisco. I can't be angry at the price for being one of the better pass rushers in the league. I can't be angry with it. I'm in the middle on that. I like the signing. I'm not necessarily sold on the price. But we'll see how it pays out. They also brought in quarterback Sam Darnold for the Carolina Panthers on a 1-year deal worth $4.5 million per season. Last season, Sam Darnold had a little over 1,100 pass yards with 9 total touchdowns, 7 passing and 2 on the ground, and 3 interceptions. Not a terrible stat line for only $4.5 million. Sam might be an option in San Francisco. You never know. Just never know. Sam Darnold has played with the Jets and the Panthers. Not very good examples of organizations to build a young quarterback in because it just doesn't seem to pay out. But now he's got some years under his belt and he's going to a team that knows how to be competitive. And if they can make that work for only $4.5 million a season, kudos to them. And moving on to the Seattle Seahawks. Getting defensive end Draymond Jones from the Denver Broncos on a 3-year, $51.53 million contract, $30 million guaranteed, and an average annual salary of $17.1 million per season. Last season, Draymond Jones, in 13 starts, had 47 total tackles, was tied for 13th with 7 sacks, and had a forced fumble. Solid pass rusher, and I think he could have reached double-digit sacks if he had played the whole season. They are also bringing in from the Broncos defensive tackle Jarran Reed on a 2-year, $10.8 million contract with an average annual salary of $4.5 million per season, who last year in 14 starts had 52 total tackles, 4 sacks, and a forced fumble. Again, decent production, $4.5 million a season, win for the Seahawks. You're also bringing in safety Julian Love from the New York Giants on a 2-year, $12 million contract with an average annual salary of $6 million per season. Julian last season had 81 total tackles, 2 interceptions, and gave up 34 receptions on 48 targets. Solid coverage, solid at the pass rush. Only $6 million per season. Another win for Seattle. And coming in from Pittsburgh is Devin Bush at linebacker on a 1-year deal worth $3.5 million per season. Last year had 81 total tackles. I think him going there with, last but not least, Bobby Wagner, who signed a 1-year contract worth up to $7 million to go back to Seattle from the Rams. I think that those are both solid signings. The fact that Bobby Wagner went for so cheap back to Seattle, that's a W across the board there as far as these linebackers go. Moving on to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, signed Baker Mayfield at quarterback from the LA Rams on a 1-year, $8.5 million contract. Last season, passed for over 2,100 pass yards, 10 touchdowns, 8 interceptions, and a 79 quarterback rating. Baker, right now, it seems it's like you get what you pay for. $8.5 million, it's not too much. I'd call that a win for the Buccaneers. Potential starter, right out the gate if the Buccaneers can't find a better option. Also coming into Tampa from the Denver Broncos, Chase Edmonds at running back on a 1-year deal worth $1.2 million. Last season, Chase had 68 carries for 245 yards and 2 touchdowns, averaging 3.6 yards per carry. Not great, but again, only costing $1.2 million. I'll call it a win. And last but not least for the Buccaneers, for at defensive tackle from the Los Angeles Rams, they got Greg Gaines at 1 year, $3.5 million, who last year had 30 total tackles and 4 sacks. For only $3.5 million, that is a solid pickup. Going to the Tennessee Titans from the Jacksonville Jaguars, defensive lineman Arden Key on a 1-year deal worth $7 million. Last season, Arden had 27 total tackles and 5 sacks, proving to be very productive when on the field, and an average annual salary of $7 million per season over the next 3 years, I think is a good price to pay for him. He's only 26 years old. He's still got plenty left. He'll fit in nicely in Tennessee. And last but not least, going to the Titans from the Buccaneers, Sean Murphy-Bunting, cornerback, who last season had 31 total tackles, 2 interceptions, allowing 22 receptions for 40 yards. Great in coverage when he was out on the field. And he's only going to earn a base salary of $1 million. I feel like he sold himself short. Huge W for the Titans. Big L for Sean Murphy. And going on to our last team, the Washington Commanders. They are getting Andrew Wiley, offensive tackle from the Kansas City Chiefs, on a 3-year, $24 million contract with an average annual salary of $8 million per season. Last year, Andrew had played 1,093 snaps, was tied for the 21st most penalties with 8, and tied for 3rd with the most sacks allowed with 9 sacks. Averaging $8 million per season, I wouldn't have paid him that much. I mean, if you're with an offense that's as good as KC and you're giving up that much damage, I can't imagine that things are going to be any better for him production-wise in Washington. I think that's an L. But what I think is not necessarily an L is offensive lineman Nick Gates that they're going to be getting from the New York Giants on a 3-year, $16.5 million contract, $8 million guaranteed, with an average annual salary of $5.5 million. Last season, he played in 368 offensive snaps, which was 10 games that he played in. 8 of them he started. He allowed 4 penalties, which is pretty high for what he was in for, but he allowed only 1 sack. And he's only 27 years old, and he's going to be cheap, but he's going to be there for the next 3 years, and I feel like that that's going to be the bigger win than Andrew Wiley in Washington. And with that, we have finished up talking about the free agency today. That is going to be the end of this podcast. I think we're going to be changing it up to 2 days a week for the podcast, to sort of give myself a little bit more time to handle outside activities and the family life. Life is very busy, as I'm sure that everybody is aware, but we're going to go from 3 a week down to 2 a week, I think, at this point, and we'll go from there and see how that turns out. If you were on the YouTube side of things, if you liked what you heard, do not forget to hit that subscribe button and give a thumbs up on this video and turn on the notification bell so you know whenever I put up a video. If you're on the Spotify side of things, don't forget to follow the podcast. And that is going to be it from me, and I will catch up with you magnificent bastards on the flip side.